A little bit.
I'm going to keep this short. Jim's going to give a talk on battleships versus aircraft carriers, retired U.S. Navy captain, professor at U.S. Navy War College. I found this a very interesting article, so I'm very happy that Jim has agreed to join us today. And so without any more ado, Jim, go ahead and take over. I'm going to go ahead.
Okay, thank you. First of all, let me ask, can people hear me satisfactorily?
Yes. I hear you well.
Yes.
Okay, very good. Yeah, as Vince said, I'm on the faculty of the Naval War College. Was a Navy 06, surface line for 6 years, intelligence for 21 years, did both surface and carrier tours. So pretty good idea of naval operations, at least over the past 50 years or so. And I'm not a historian, let me say that right up front. I wrote this out of, and researched it out of interest to ongoing work that I do at the Naval War College, not out of historical interest, but the application of this thesis to the development of the future fleet. Let me click through this. There we go. I've got a lot of data on the slides here because I didn't know the extent to which people had read this article. It was published in the most recent issue of the Journal of Maritime History, or Military History. And so I have a lot of detail on the slides, but I'm not going to read the slides. I will allow you to read them, and I will just hit the highlights. Essentially, what you're looking at here is what I call the revisionists, the post-World War II analysts and historians who review naval operations in World War II and drew largely these following conclusions. And in fact, this is just a small sampling of what historians believed happened in the Pacific War and World War II. At the end of the presentation, if you're interested, I got 5 more slides with about 50 more quotes on there. But generally, this is the accepted view of the relationship of carriers and surface ships, and battleships in particular, from the war. And as you can see, there's a general belief, which I think is prevalent today with rare exception, that battleships were highly vulnerable to air attack, were relegated to a secondary role throughout the war, generally in backwaters, doing things like shore bombardment, but only under air cover. That there was a massive transition from a battleship-centric fleet to a carrier-centric fleet, and the carrier emerged by the end of the war as, in Barrett-Tillman's view, the most nearly perfect instrument of sea power. And my view is all of these are wrong. I mean, it's not even something that's debatable. These are just absolutely wrong conclusions. And I hope to make that case through the presentation today and through the data in my article. This is my thesis here, that there was no revolution at sea. You can see my definition of sea control, and sea control was critical in World War II, specifically to either facilitate or defend against amphibious assaults and to facilitate and defend against blockades. And the side that could do that successfully was going to emerge victorious. My view is the battleship remained the ultimate sea control platform, and was the ultimate platform that was necessary by both sides in order to be able to achieve and maintain sea control. Now, the battleship was not invulnerable. It was vulnerable to mines, to torpedoes, and even to some extent, minor extent, to air attack. And so the battleship had to operate as part of a larger fleet of a broad range of assets, of which, in my view, the aircraft carrier was one of the least important rather than one of the most important. The battleship was sufficiently effective and survivable. The advantage at sea in every theater, the Pacific, the Mediterranean, or the Atlantic, accrued to the side that fielded the most and best battleships in the war. And it is somewhat difficult for people to understand the value of the battleship in World War II because there were no major culminating engagements like Jutland. And in fact, like most of World War I, in World War II, both sides are continually doing a correlation of forces calculation to determine whether or not they should engage. In the first year of the war, the Japanese are urgently seeking a main force engagement with the United States fleet in the Pacific. Nimitz will not accommodate them. The last 3 years of the war, the US is urgently seeking a main force engagement with the Japanese. The Japanese get close at the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf, but then for a variety of reasons back off. But the fact that there was no main force engagement is somewhat irrelevant because victory was eventually assured through deterrence of that main force engagement. By comparison, the carrier was an episodic raider. I mean, it could appear for very short periods of time, inflict some minor damage, but then had to withdraw rapidly. It could deny, but it could not control. It's like a submarine. And even today, the carrier is not a sea control platform. It's a denial platform and an episodic denial platform. So that's one half of my thesis in this article. The other half is this. This was known by US naval leaders during the war. They had no illusions about the relative importance of the battleship and aircraft carrier and knew throughout the Pacific War that the battleship was the backbone of the fleet and the aircraft carrier was an auxiliary to the battleship. And when you read through particularly the Gray Book, which luckily while I was doing research on this a number of years ago, the Naval War College historians had digitized the entire Gray Book and made it readily accessible. It's quite clear when you go through all 2,000 pages what the attitudes were of the senior naval leaders in the Pacific regarding carriers and battleships. And they considered the battleship to be supreme, not only through the war, but in the post-war years. In fact, my original question was, why have historians continued to sustain the myth of carrier superiority when that was not accepted by the war and that myth did not arise until well after the war, somewhere in the early to mid 1950s? All of a sudden, everything changes and all the histories change in order to reflect this notion that the carrier was superior and the battleship had become obsolete. By the way, the article is only a small portion of the research that I did. I wrote and still have a 350-page treatment of battleships and carriers throughout World War II. About 135,000 words, but realized I would probably never get around to publishing that in a book. So I took a small section of that, about 17,000 words, to turn it into an article. And then to get it published in JMH, I had to cut it by another quarter and deleted at least half of the footnotes. So an awful lot of the basic analysis that went into this has been compressed down into a fairly compact article in JMH. Does this have modern relevance? Well, that's why I first got involved in this, not out of historic curiosity, but the fact that I think bears directly on the work that I've been doing at the Naval War College for the past 20 years, a lot of which has to do with this ongoing debate about what the future US fleet should look like. And even as we speak now, a 30-year shipbuilding plan is being developed to send up to the Secretary of Defense to describe the US fleet through the year 2050. And we've just recently said we expect all new carriers to have a 50-year lifespan, which means carriers that we are going to build in the next couple of decades are going to be with us through the year 2100, and presumably will continue to be the central organizing element of the fleet with sea control as their core mission. And in fact, the carrier within Navy hierarchy is still deemed to be the ultimate sea control platform. I mean, we actually see those words. And I think an awful lot of that is based upon this perception that in World War II, the carrier was a sea control platform and did win the naval war at sea, not only in the Pacific, but I think most people, if asked, would believe that it dominated naval operations in the Atlantic, where hardly any carriers operated, and in the Mediterranean, again, where hardly any carriers operated, but were big fields of battleship operations. Those are the common beliefs down at the bottom. Carrier dominated war at sea, won the war at sea, and in fact, beyond that, marked a revolution in military affairs, which saw the transition from a surface-dominated, battleship-dominated force to an air-dominated force. I start out the article, with what I consider to be the ultimate test. Let's just start with the ultimate test of carrier air versus surface ships. And that was the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Leyte Gulf is the largest naval battle in history. October 1944, the combined 7th, 3rd Fleet, MacArthur, Nimitz, land on the island of Leyte in the Philippines. The entire US fleet is there, everything. Japan decides we're going to oppose this with our entire fleet. And so you can see the Japanese fleet on the left side of the slide, 4 carriers, used as decoys, very few aircraft, but every operational battleship they had, every operational cruiser, 30 destroyers. On the US side, you have 35 aircraft carriers, including 7 of the new Essex class, each of which carries as many as 100 aircraft. And these are all combat aircraft, no support aircraft. Total of 1,500 combat aircraft of the newest varieties. So you have 3 full days of carrier airstrikes in perfect weather, 1,300 combat sorties on virtually the entire Japanese fleet. And you can look at the kill tally there. It's almost inconsequential. Almost inconsequential what the US carriers were able to do. 4 aircraft carriers were sunk, but again, almost carrying no aircraft. They were just decoys. 1 battleship, it was Musashi, one of the 2 super battleships in the world. 4 cruisers, but only 2 were sunk en route, the actual battle area, and 1 destroyer. And I think what's most interesting is when Halsey believes that the bulk of the Japanese fleet is up to the north, which was actually a decoy force, he sends his fast battleships, Task Force 34, at high speed up there to engage them. He seemed to have no confidence that his aircraft carriers could blunt this force, and he was right, they couldn't have. Once Kurita's force comes through the San Bernardino Strait to threaten the Leyte landing area, and the US fast battleships are gone, CDF-77, who's defending the amphibious landing area, doesn't ask for aircraft. He's got plenty of aircraft, and they're not doing much of anything against the approaching Japanese force. What he says is, I need fast battleships urgently at Leyte Gulf. Nimitz then weighs in and says, where is Task Force 34? Where are the fast battleships? I mean, there were no illusions at Leyte Gulf. The carrier air was going to do any more than kill or damage a few Japanese ships. We needed a battleship force in order to confront the Japanese main fleet. So this is it, the ultimate test of the war. And I think it was, it should have, just closed the door on this issue of whether or not carriers, could defeat a battleship-led force. It couldn't. The next slide is not part of the article, but I put it in here just to give a broad overview of battleship losses in World War II. There were total, by my counting, which you can quibble with, there are 89 capital ships on the Allied and Axis side. 28 were lost during the war. Of those 28, only 5 were from carrier air, and only 2 from carrier air while operating at sea. The 3 others were Arizona and Oklahoma, which were moored in port during peacetime, and the other was Conte de Cavour, which was in Taranto at the time and was anchored. And so you can see down the list on both sides what killed all the other battleships. But quite frankly, despite a huge number of carrier attacks on enemy battleships throughout the war on both sides of both the Atlantic, Pacific, as well as the Mediterranean, the actual tally really is 2. Which hardly supports this contention that battleships were not survivable against carrier air attack, or that somehow carriers were now ruling the waves. So what did it take to sink a carrier, or rather a battleship at sea with carrier air? Well, here's Musashi, 5 hours of strikes by 100 aircraft, 19 torpedo hits. Yamato, 2 hours of strikes, 280 air sorties. This is what it takes in order to put down a modern battleship. Essentially, it takes an entire fleet of carriers. Yamato's interesting because my personal connection is my father was an Avenger pilot off San Jacinto in the last year of the war and actually flew on the Yamato strike and described it for me. And the way he described it is he had never seen so many US aircraft in such a big marshalling stack at one time, being called in one by one, hour after hour to go in and make a strike on this battleship, which impressed me at the time. And now I realize that, a state-of-the-art battleship was operationally virtually unsinkable because of the opportunity cost. I mean, if you're spending your entire carrier force against one platform for half of the daylight hours, you're not attacking anything else. And that was the lesson of Leyte Gulf, where virtually the entire U.S. carrier force that's available is going after one ship, and the rest of the carrier, the rest of the Japanese surface force is approaching Leyte. I'm being a little snarky at the bottom when I say, did it really matter? Probably not, because the prospect of actually hitting a moving ship at sea with an aircraft was so low that the probability of shifting those strikes from Musashi to the rest of the Japanese fleet might have accounted for only a couple of more ships. So the next 3 slides talk about the reality of carrier air, poor survivability and poor effectiveness. I'll just hit a couple of points, but you can read through here. Essentially, carriers had to remain well clear of land-based air, had to remain well clear of surface gunships. At night, would clear at high speed away from the battle area to avoid being run down by 30-knot gunships. That was the lesson from the fleet problems in the 20s and 30s. Lesson from HMS Glorious: do not be caught by a gunship. Air reconnaissance was abysmal. If they could have relied on air reconnaissance, they could have taken more risks, but both on the US and Japanese side, it was horrendous. Largely not through technological limitations, but because of neglect. And at least in the Pacific, I put the onus on Halsey and Mitchell, who simply did not want to do air reconnaissance and did not want to do night flight operations, although it was possible. Carriers were highly vulnerable, minimally armed, very explosive. A single bomb could kill a carrier. It was rare that a single bomb could kill a battleship. Yes, I'll give you Arizona. It was rare that a single torpedo could kill a battleship. I'll give you Prince of Wales. You do get those lucky hits, but carriers were, as a class of ship, were extremely vulnerable. This meant that carriers had an absolute need above all else to engage enemy carriers before any other mission, which includes ignoring the center of gravity, generally a landing force of the other side, while you're conducting this carrier-on-carrier duel. And in most cases, the carrier-on-carrier battles in the Pacific War, which there were only 6, it was a mutual death pact. Look at Coral Sea, 3 of 5 carriers on both sides sunk or out of action. Midway, 5 of 7, which means that neither side could do any follow-on carrier strike operations, which means neither side was able to attack the landing force, which was the purpose of being there in the first place. Insufficient effectiveness, limited number of sorties. Generally, an average carrier could do 3 days of combat. This became critical at Leyte Gulf when carriers had to stay for 9 days and essentially had virtually no combat effectiveness left. A carrier load was only 2 torpedoes. And you can look at the probability of hit with a torpedo throughout the war, 15%. And then calculate how many torpedoes it would be required to sink a modern battleship. And that explains why it takes dozens upon dozens of flights and many, many carriers in order to go against one capital ship. What's interesting when you look at the difficulty in hitting a maneuvering ship in World War II is to compare those numbers to what we have today. Level bombing, 0%, torpedo attacks, 15%. Today we're with modern precision guided munitions, the probability of hitting a maneuvering target absent any enemy defenses is about 90%. That's a true revolution in warfare that's occurred within the last 20 years. But in actual practice, look at Battleship Issei at Leyte Gulf. 100 US aircraft attacked that old World War I battleship and it suffered only 2 minor hits. That's typical of carrier attacks on battleships throughout the war. The actual sinkings are the exceptions. The damage are the exceptions, not the rule. Moreover, carrier dive bombers were limited on the US side, 2,000-pound bomb payloads, and there's no instance of a 1,000-pound bomb penetrating battleship deck armor that I know of. What you were doing with carrier bombs is to try and destroy the ability of the carrier to optically see targets, and then destroy the AAA in order to bring in your torpedo bombers. This is why you're conducting these huge numbers of bombing strikes on battleships, simply because you're trying to facilitate the torpedo bomber approach. So at the bottom there, you can see the torpedo was the killer if you could get torpedoes close enough and get a hit. But you needed massive defense suppression to do that. At the Battle of Midway, as we all know, 43 of 48 torpedo aircraft on the US side were lost with no hits on the Japanese fleet. And in fact, after that, Spruan said, we will never authorize a torpedo attack on the Japanese fleet without a complete suppression of Japanese aircraft and AAA. It was just, it was a death ride if you were going to do this. And in fact, that really soured the US fleet on torpedo operations until near the end of the war. More on insufficient effectiveness. This is airstrikes on land targets. You know, if the prospect of hitting a ship was bad, the prospect of hitting, let's say, a gun revetment was no better. You know, to hit a single gun, the prospect was about 1 in 300 in a dive, 1 in 10,000 from high altitude. Now, I would say this, that surface gunnery, when you bring in cruisers and battleships in order to try and destroy gun revetments, it was no better. It was equally awful. But once again, you reflect back from present day when we're dealing with precision-guided weapons where there's virtually a 90% probability of hit on the first shot. This is a true revolution in warfare that's occurred in recent times. Air suppression, yes, agree. The Navy claimed 15,000 Japanese planes destroyed by carrier air. Don't disagree with that at all. Most of those were destroyed on the ground. But in actual practice, you know, again, going to Leyte Gulf in October 44, carrier air ran 4,000 strike sorties. Philippines, Formosa, Okinawa, trying to destroy Japanese aircraft on the ground. That was in October, but by the next month, that capability was spent and the Japanese had regained air control over the Philippines and maintained it. And that was one reason the Leyte campaign went on for months, simply because carrier air was unable to interdict Japanese reinforcement of Leyte and was unable to gain control of the air. And control of the air was not gained until land-based air was able to go into the Philippines and establish true air superiority. And that was always accepted. It was always accepted that carrier air would go in for 2 to 3 days, knock down the Japanese air, but within 2 to 3 days, land-based air would go in there and would then establish air superiority. And the problem in the Philippines and at Leyte was this lack of understanding of the topography, which made it extremely difficult to operate an airfield in that type of marshy ground. It took a long time to get US Army Air Forces in there. You also have this issue throughout the Pacific War, and if you read The Fast Carriers by Clark Reynolds, you know, it comes through in spades, that the carrier proponents throughout the Pacific War on the US side are fighting tooth and nail for strategic missions. They hated fleet support. They hated direct ground support. What they wanted to do was fly strategic airstrikes against enemy rear areas. And that was done to quite a large extent, but with limited effectiveness. Limited effectiveness for carrier in the Pacific, limited effectiveness by Claire Chennault in China, limited effectiveness in Europe. I mean, it was a proposal that just never paid off. I think AAA is underplayed, and I think the survivability of ships to anti-aircraft artillery is not fully appreciated. One thing I found out that kind of shocked me is at Pearl Harbor, 19 Japanese aircraft were down by AAA against unalerted ships in port in peacetime. That's kind of astounding. But look at Coral Sea, where you have a split in the U.S. fleet. Admiral Crace is sent with a very, very small portion of the fleet to try and attack the Japanese landing force en route Port Moresby with no air cover. He's attacked heavily by Japanese air, by 85 planes, not dissimilar to what it went against Prince of Wales and Repulse, and yet survives. 2/3 of the Japanese torpedo bombers are down with no hits on any Allied ships. Empress Augusta Bay, you know, they're probably the most quintessential case in 1943, a 100-plane Japanese airstrike on a U.S. surface group, 17 planes down, 2 minor hits. And that was before the introduction of the proximity fuse. AAA was just incredibly deadly. Now, you do have later in the war the introduction of the FX-1400, the so-called Fritz X and kamikazes, but neither one proves sufficiently effective or uncounterable throughout the war. Nevertheless, they were harbingers of a future era which would be dominated by long-range precision strike as sea combat is today. These are the 6 big carrier battles. I mean, when you talk about Pacific War history, everyone centers on these. You know, this is, people believe this is, you know, how the Pacific War was fought. It was just carrier on carrier, and every one of these battles led to victory. I am less impressed by the 6 carrier battles, to tell you the truth. The first 4, Midway, Coral Sea, Eastern Solomon, Santa Cruz, these were carrier on carrier self-preservation duels. And mutual damage in each one of these precluded any further operations. And in each one of these, you had carrier operations on both sides, either in support of or defending against ground operations, but in no case, as we'll see, did the carriers ever attack the ground invasion forces. In other words, in none of these battles did the carriers have any direct impact on the land action, which in operational art parlance, we call the center of gravity. It was simply a self-preservation duel. At the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf, you know, these were massive US carrier forces, but in both cases unable to blunt the approaching Japanese fleet. The Philippine Sea is notorious because the US fleet could not find the Japanese fleet until it was actually departing the area and was beyond strike range. I mean, it was a massive, massive failure in US air reconnaissance, which could have proven fatal. Luckily, Willis Lee, with his battleship force, had been mobilized at the beach at Guam and was ready in order to blunt the Japanese approach, as was part of the main battle plan. And of course, we talked about Leyte Gulf. This is where carrier air did find the Japanese fleet, attacked it in tremendous force to virtually no effect. Now, I did put asterisks on here because the carrier did have an indirect effect in each one of these battles, because the Japanese lost their nerve once their carriers were lost. At Midway, there was nothing to prevent the Japanese from bombarding Midway after the loss of their carriers and actually landing their landing force. I don't know if it would have been successful, but they could have. But with the loss of the carriers, they decided not to do that. And in my own view, Yamamoto never really was that interested in Midway. He was interested in bringing the US fleet out over something that he thought Nimitz would value highly, and having the Jutland-style engagement. And indeed, Task Force 1 with the 7 US battleships out of San Francisco did sortie forward, and Nimitz said, no, I'm not going to engage, not here, not now. At Coral Sea, I think is, in my view, kind of notorious, because Fletcher says, hey, I'm going to be, you know, I've just discovered the Japanese fleet. I have to default to self-preservation. Breaks off a very small force to try and defeat the Japanese landing. Once the Japanese lose their carriers, they call off the landing on Port Moresby, because I think doctrine says you have to have carrier air support to do a landing. Same thing at the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf. You know, at the moment of decision, the senior Japanese admiral says, I'm going to pull my force back once my carriers are lost, once air control is lost. I think because they had adhered to this very rigid doctrine of a requirement to have carrier air support surface operations. Yet, there was nothing that would have prevented their surface forces from continuing on and actually attacking the landing area. So I would say, yes, I agree the carriers did have a major impact on the outcome of those battles, but it was extremely indirect and based entirely on what I would call the irrationality of the Japanese leadership. So here's a little bit more detail on the carrier impact. At Coral Sea, there were 60 Japanese combatants, auxiliaries, assault ships, 12 troop transports, which were never engaged by the carriers. In fact, the US carriers were some 200 miles east of there. Fletcher knew that this Japanese invasion force would enter Port Moresby, and then suddenly found out the Japanese carriers were nearby. And that's a case at Coral Sea where the US and Japanese carriers were twice within 70 miles of each other and didn't detect each other, suddenly discover each other. Fletcher says, I'm going to keep my 2 fleet carriers because I have to attack the Japanese carriers first. I'm also keeping 6 cruisers and 12 destroyers to protect my carriers. But I'm going to send Admiral Krasov with 3 cruisers and 2 destroyers to attack the Japanese center of gravity. We don't know how that would have come out. But I mean, essentially, he took a tiny, tiny portion of his force without any air cover and said, you know, go and try and prevent the landing. I don't think that Coral Sea deserves a whole lot of accolades based on the decisions that were made and how this came out. Midway, 125 Japanese ships in the invasion force. I don't think the US carriers got within 400 miles of that Japanese invasion force. Santa Cruz Islands, 50 Japanese combatants and auxiliaries. The U.S. carriers were able to sink one light carrier, never attacked the combatants or auxiliary forces other than that. Of course, Philippine Sea, the Japanese fleet was never found until it was too late. And at Leyte Gulf, we talked about that. It worked out for the U.S. in these carrier battles, but I think it was based upon Japanese admiral irrationality, and you cannot count on the enemy being irrational when you go into combat. On the other hand, this is something that surprised me, and I don't know why I never knew this, and until I read Trent Hohn's article in the Naval War College Review in 2008, and followed it up with original source research, this was a shock to me, that in the Central Pacific Drive, at every single juncture, every single landing, it was expected that the Japanese fleet would oppose it, and provision was made for the massing of US battleships in a traditional battle line. So the Gilberts in 43, the Marshalls, Truk, Humboldt Bay, Marianas, all up to Lingayen Gulf, the US commander is massing his battleships, preparing for the Battle of Jutland. I think we're fooled by the fact that in between these major operations, the battleships were distributed and subordinated to carrier battle groups on their episodic raids in order to provide air cover. But as soon as it was expected that the Japanese fleet was going to make an appearance, they were marshaled into one group, set up in a traditional battle line, and prepared for the engagement. That was intended, and it was only, the Japanese only opposed the US twice with a battle line. One was in the Marianas, and then terminated it once their air cover was lost. So there was no engagement, but could have been. And then at Leyte Gulf, where there was no major engagement, with a single exception of Surigao Strait. Yes, there was an engagement there, a minor battleship engagement. But Halsey had pulled the major US battleships away from the landing area, and then at the last minute, the Japanese commander Kurita lost his nerve and then withdrew. So yes, there are many junctures where there could have been a Battle of Jutland, but weren't. I just threw in at the bottom there something I was unaware of, but you historians might know more about, was Operation Setting Sun, which was a proposal in 1943 that was sent to Nimitz. I don't know from whom, but probably King. Which says, hey, we're just wasting our time down here in the Solomons. What we need to do is mobilize the entire US fleet, every combatant, move from Wake Island to the Bonins, Iwo Jima, and then goad the Japanese into coming out into a full-fledged Jutland-style battle in 1943, and let's have it out. Nimitz backed off and said, no, I'm not interested. But there was a real desire to actually employ the battleships in a major force-on-force engagement close to Japan pretty early in the war. Fleet employment. This, these are extracts that come from the operational plans of the Philippine Sea and Lingayen Gulf. And you can see the quotes there. What I would say is this is a traditional battle force employment, which would not have been unfamiliar to the opposing commanders at Jutland in 1960. To say that the United States had moved from a battleship-centric force to a carrier-centric strike force is, again, just erroneous when you look at the actual operational plans. And what did Admiral Halsey, supposedly the quintessential carrier admiral, think of battleships? Well, he loved them. He thought he could not do without them. Certainly at Leyte Gulf in 1944, but this goes back to 1943 when he's still in the Solomons and Nimitz is beginning the Central Pacific Drive. Halsey is begging him to send battleships into the Solomons because he doesn't think that his air cover is enough to blunt a major Japanese attack. As he says right here, I'll be at a dangerous disadvantage. Strongly urge I be reinforced with battleships as soon as possible. And again, okay, Nimitz, you're denying me my battleships because you want them in the Central Pacific Drive. Again, not for shore bombardment, but to face the Japanese fleet. I'll do the best I can, but I hate to give the Japanese an even break. The next slide looks at the operational battleship matchup throughout the war. So on the left, you have Japan at various times, the US more on the right. You can look at the Japan total down the line, and of those, how many are new? On the US side, it says US total, like from December 6, 1941, it says 17. 9 in the Pacific, 8 in the Atlantic, 2 are new. And though both of those are in the Atlantic. So you can see the United States, in terms of battleship totals, is never at a disadvantage to the Japanese. They are at a disadvantage in the Pacific. Why? Because so many battleships are being held in the Atlantic, including new battleships, to confront the German raiders, specifically Bismarck. Well, Bismarck is sunk by now, but specifically Tirpitz, and the other raiders, because there was evidently zero confidence that even land-based air in the Atlantic was going to be able to handle these big capital ships that were coming out of the German ports. And that continues all the way down until November 44, when Tirpitz is finally sunk up in a Norwegian fjord. And finally, all the US new battleships are released to the Pacific, where they can add to the total. I would point out a couple of things on the right. One is the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal in 1942. Clearly the turning point in the war, not midway. This is where Yamamoto has only committed his 4 old converted Congo-class battle cruisers to the Solomons. And that's sufficient until Nimitz gets new battleships, South Dakota, North Carolina, Washington, Indiana, and sends them into the Solomons. And as soon as Yamamoto finds out that the US is committing new battleships to the Solomons, he says, that's it, I'm backing off, I'm pulling out of the Solomons, it's over. That was the real turning point of the war, in my view. It was by Samuel Eliot Morison. If you read his 15-volume history, not the 2-volume history, but the 15-volume history, he says that was the turning point of the war, and I agree. It's interesting when you look at that quote at the bottom. As late as May 1945, Nimitz is ordering all battleships, including the US old battleships, to be loaded with armor-piercing rounds, given the possibility of major surface action. And this is at a time when Japan had 3 battleships total, 1 new battleship. And in fact, Yamato gets sunk shortly after February 1945. But even then, there seemed to be no confidence that this massive carrier force was going to be able to blunt these Japanese battleships. So just looking at some box scores here, this is not in the article, although there's a summary of it there, but it does beg the question, how did US carriers do against all Japanese combatants? And when you look at the totals here, US carrier air accounted for 67 of 316, that's 21%. And you can look at the relative percentage of kills in the lower right-hand corner. Does beg the question, which I didn't calculate, what's the cost per kill of a carrier versus a submarine versus surface ships? I think submarines are at the top, surface next, carriers probably come out at the bottom. This is Japanese carriers versus US combatants. Carrier air accounted for a total of 10 US combatants, 2 battleships, arguably before the war started, 3 carriers, a few destroyers, and 1 submarine. And these are the box scores: US carriers versus Japanese merchant ships, about 1 in 6. And again, you have to say what was the cost per kill. There are counter-revisionists, few, very few. David Hamer, William McBride, and our own Vincent O'Hara, who said, wait a minute, I think maybe we have this wrong. But I would say this is the clear minority of individuals who look back to World War II and said we probably underappreciated the battleship, and we have overstated the impact of the carrier. Once again, if you're interested, I'll pull up 5 more slides at the end, which have the revisionist view rather than the counter-revisionist view. But it's few and far between individuals who buy into this idea that the battleship was still supreme. So what happened to the battleship? Well, I agree with Norman Friedman. After 1945, there were no capital ships left to fight. I mean, there was some concern about Soviet intentions because they did have some capital ships, a few, and intelligence was very spotty on what they were doing. There was some belief that they had battle cruisers under construction. We knew they were building light cruisers. In August 45, Admiral King says, this is what I want: 12 new battleships in active service, 7 in reserve, old battleships in reserve, 6 old battleships to be decommissioned. But it was mostly, economic issues which caused the major movement of battleships into the reserve. And the primary point is, they were just too expensive to maintain if you did not have enemy capital ships to fight. So a Baltimore-class heavy cruiser had less than half the crew requirement of an Iowa, and a heavy cruiser was probably quite sufficient to take on the light cruisers in the Soviet inventory. So by 1945, I have 1 battleship left in service, USS Missouri, and only 23 cruisers. And eventually, all other new capital ships were taken out of service and put into reserve by the 60s. And then by the 70s, there's only the 4 new ones that are left. So what is the origin and persistence of the myth? Where did this myth come from? Because I'm quite certain this was nothing that people believed during World War II. It grew up after the war. And I see a couple of major instigators of this myth. The first is tremendous U.S. Navy air PR, about what they're doing in wartime, feeding this wartime press that wants to see a lot of action. Carrier aviators were heroes in action. The battleships were simply plodding forward, challenging the Japanese to a fight, and the Japanese keep denying that fight. So there is no fight, except this naval night battle in Guadalcanal, which no one got to see, and the naval night battle at Surigao Strait, which no one got to see. Carrier air gets a whole lot of great press. Battleships get 0 press. Then there's the U.S. Navy air versus U.S. Army Air Force air. The U.S. Army Air Force, later U.S. Air Force, is trying to take over all aviation functions, saying land-based air can do everything plus more that naval aviation can do. And so the Navy, not only the carrier aviators, but the Navy has to try and get a budget wedge and start building this story that it was Navy carrier air that won the Pacific War. The Navy can't justify keeping battleships in the fleet, but they can justify keeping carriers in the fleet. And so they say the carrier air won the war in the Pacific and will be equally critical for all future wars. And that has been the mantra of U.S. Navy and U.S. Navy carrier air for the past 75 years. U.S. Navy carrier air won the war in the Pacific and will win our future wars. The Navy also, and this is important as well, needed an icon. I mean, something that represents the Navy. And a submarine doesn't do that. A destroyer doesn't do that. You need a big, imposing, powerful ship. And the carrier itself looks like power. And one of the problems we have today as we continue to think about and debate the post-carrier Navy is, what is the icon? What is it that represents the U.S. fleet? And I think other countries like Britain and China and Russia field carriers because they need this blue water icon. It has no other particular purpose in high-end combat, but they need the icon. So I understand all that. I mean, all that makes a lot of sense. There's no question about that. But the question is, why has this myth persisted among historians since the end of World War II? And I think it's just become the accepted wisdom from what are considered to be the great sages, like Samuel Eliot Morison. And it's also a very engaging case study in innovation. People love this. Samson versus Goliath. It's the young, innovative radicals defeating the dinosaur Luddites. It's something which you want to apply to almost every other case where you want to demonstrate the need for innovation. And I will say this, carrier aviators did emerge as the victors in the bureaucratic fight for control of the Navy. So they did win that. It was based upon a myth, but yes, they did win. So let me finish up here with critical questions that I think we're trying to wrestle with today. If the carrier historically and today is insufficiently effective and survivable against modern opponents, what is the future organizing principle of the U.S. Navy, if not the carrier? What is the fleet's icon? And finally, the most disquieting one, in this era of long-range precision strike dominance, where my probability of hit is not 1 in 10,000, but 9 out of 10, is true sea control unattainable between modern high-tech opponents? In other words, the only thing you get in the future is sea denial. So, to make a long story short, all of this historic background on carrier operations and battleship operations in World War II is feeding my analysis to address these two particular questions. So let me terminate there and see what comments and questions I can get from the audience. Thank you.
Very much, Jim. I think that was very interesting. And I'm going to go ahead and anybody has a question, just state it. And
Sure, I'll speak up. Just with respect to the Battle of Midway, I would call out some quibbles, I think. First, with respect to the inability of the American carriers to prosecute follow-on strikes after that battle, you would note that Makuma went to her watery grave and Mogami was crippled as a result of those follow-on strikes. Likewise, yeah, they didn't have a direct impact on the Japanese landing forces, but the landing forces have been withdrawn. Mm-hmm. So, you know, I guess I would say that the Americans were left in possession of the battlefield at that point and had clearly demonstrated that they had sea control of that area. I'd also fast forward to Operation Tenichigo and the demise of Yamato. Yeah, I suppose you could make the argument that it took 2 hours to put her down, but the end result was 6 Japanese warships sunk, 4,000 soldiers killed for the loss of 10 aircraft and 12 aviators. If that's not a walkover, I don't know what it is. So anyway, just my 2 cents on some of your points.
Not on the Midway one, I agree with you. I mean, the Japanese withdrew. I mean, didn't have to, but they did withdraw. I do give you Makuma and Mogami. They collided, and then the U.S. went in for the kill against a cruiser that was already heavily damaged. But and this is what is kind of the interesting aspect of this, that in many cases it was in the Japanese mind the impact of the outcome of the carrier fight which drove them to make a decision which, in my view, was inefficient and counterproductive, as they did at Midway. But you're right. At the end of the day, they withdrew and pulled back and never showed up again. So I'll give you that. So I don't disagree with that. Thank you.
If I could raise a point, one of the things that I thought the article and the presentation didn't really focus on sufficiently was the fact that carriers could do a mission kill on these ships, not necessarily sink them. But you've got several cases during the war, and I think therefore a fear that it would happen again, that even your best ships, your largest battleships, could be damaged sufficiently to make you withdraw them from the action. So I think the article focuses too much on what was actually sunk versus both the actuality and the concern over the mission kill of ships.
No, I agree with that. And I think probably that was underplayed, that there was, in some navies in particular, the Italian Navy, the German Navy, later on in the Japanese Navy, they knew they could not build more battleships. There were no more coming, and they became incredibly risk averse. Just the possibility of the lucky hit. And I'll give you 2 lucky hits. One was Bismarck, which jams the rudder, but Bismarck was ultimately sunk by surface ships. Prince of Wales was, I mean, the ultimate lucky hit, where steaming at high speed, torpedo hits a strut, the shaft is bent, the bent shaft reams a giant hole in the back of the ship and it fills with water. This is, and it's like a 1 in a million shot, but the battleship is sunk. And people did obsess over this. And so there was, I think, in some navies an aversion to use battleships, but I think that aversion was far less in the Royal Navy, I think, as demonstrated in the Mediterranean, in my view. I thought they were very forward-leaning. And then the U.S. Navy in the later part of the war, simply because we not only had so many battleships, but we were building so many more. I mean, you look at the number of battleships and battlecruisers on the ways, and the prospective Montana class that would have been built if there had been some need for it. Numbers makes you risk acceptance. Low numbers make you risk averse. And yes, that is a major deciding factor. I agree.
Well, I think that there's something to what Steve said. The aircraft carrier may not be able to do the sea control, but it's also easier to, in some cases, fix its offensive power. It's a lot easier to replace airplanes than it is to fix, main gun and torn up ship. Battleships take longer to repair, it seems, in general, than aircraft carriers do. Yorktown's a fine example after Coral Sea, where it's more or less patched up overnight, which may or may not have contributed to its loss later. But You know, you can lose 50 or 60 aircraft and go back and get a bunch more.
Yeah, that's true. But, you know, I also look, and I do have a database somewhere of all the air attacks on all the battleships throughout the entire war. And battleships were taking a tremendous beating, particularly kamikazes off of Okinawa were being hit consistently without any major damage at all. I mean, crew on deck are being killed, guys who are manning AAA guns, but the ship itself is generally unaffected. Whereas even modest damage on a carrier could sink it. And so it's not carrier versus battleship to some extent, it's carrier air versus land-based air, because you can't sink a land base. And I think maybe we ought to do that comparison of, you know, land-based US Army air versus US carrier air versus battleships, because, you know, land-based air is even more survivable than both.
Well, it is, except that you can't move the land-based air every place you need it.
Yeah, that's true, but I can get it in, it's a separate issue. Agree. There are issues, involved in where can I put a runway, particularly in the Pacific, where you're trying to build a runway at the very edge of these volcanic atolls. You can't just build it in the middle. So there were real limitations there that both sides could anticipate. On the other hand, I think the sheer volume of land-based air and the ability to cycle land-based air, even under attack, far outweighed the ability of carriers to bring air to the fight.
I think I'd quibble on that with respect to the battles in the Marianas, though. If you look at Japan trying to shuttle aircraft into Saipan, Guam, Rota, and yet, the sheer number of aircraft that the Americans bring to that party, 937, are able to destroy Japan's land-based air to the point that it plays no contribution in that battle. In fact, during the actual carrier engagement itself, that fleet is so powerful that it is able to suppress the Japanese air bases on all of those islands while simultaneously defending itself against Japan's incoming strikes. So that, I think, is a counter argument to the lethality of land-based air. By the time you get to mid-1944, with the advances in American logistical support for their carrier forces, they had the ability now to essentially park these things off of your objective and stay there, rotating one TG at a time out of their battle force to replenish, but keeping the other 3 or 4 on site. So, I don't know. I just put that in.
Yeah, I guess 2 things. One, numbers always matter. I mean, the U.S. showed up with numbers which were unimaginable. And if you cycle enough numbers through, you're just going to win. So we have to, so it's, I don't know that it's a great technology versus technology matchup. But the Philippine Sea, I mean, one of the advantages of the U.S. fleet not detecting the Japanese fleet is the only thing the U.S. could put up were Hellcat fighters. What Japan was putting up were strikers and putting up guys that had, I don't know, maybe 50 hours in the cockpit. It was hardly a symmetric matchup there. I think it was a preordained conclusion that hundreds and hundreds of Hellcat fighters were simply going to shoot down anything the Japanese showed up with. So it wasn't really a symmetric match.
Yeah. James, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, it wasn't working for a second ago. On both Leyte Gulf and Philippine Sea, are you making allowance for the kind of aircraft change that had happened? Because it's really amazing when you look at the records in detail. The Helldiver is the main reason the dive bomb results drop, both at Philippine Sea and in Leyte Gulf. It seems to be why they're not connecting as much. They don't seem to hit as well as the Dauntless was doing. And that's kind of an ongoing debate among aircraft enthusiasts that debate it. But you really see it at both Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf is that a percentage we've been achieving before even drops down. So it's kind of a little misleading, I think. You see it again when the Yamato sunk.
Yeah, and let me add one thing to that. One of the things I did as I was doing this research is to look at the accounts of carrier aviators in the last 2 years of the war, an awful lot of which have been published. And there's also this dominant view that seems to pervade a lot of squadrons that this war is won. I joined the Navy 2 years ago, went through flight training. I'm out here in 1944, 45. I'm not protecting the U.S. against attack. I'm going out here to take what I consider to be a reasonable amount of personal risk in order to dive in and try and hit a ship. And when you read some of these accounts, you see evidence of individuals pulling up from a dive way above AAA. An awful lot of highly trained US aviators simply are not going in for the kill. And you don't want to say that, but boy, I think that has an awful lot to do with it, not only in the Navy, but in Europe. You have, P-47 pilots, some of whom are just going right in. But I think an increasing number of pilots in the U.S. Army, Air Force, and Navy, when you get near the end of the war, late 44, early 45, are saying, I'm just not going to go into that flak. I'm going to drop my bomb from way up high. And I think we have to consider that as well. So I often wonder if the Helldiver got a really bad reputation simply because pilots are saying, I see a lot of flak out there. I'm not going to fly into it.
Yeah, I guess that could be because 94. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, a couple of quick points. First of all, I think it's very valuable what you've done here is issue this challenge and make people think harder about what happened in World War II and more so about what the structure of the fleet should be now. I did have some questions about this. First of all, I think you treat all the battleships as being equal. And Yamato and a Congo are not remotely equal in terms of offensive and particularly defensive strength. So sinking Musashi was much more than sinking 1 out of 5 battleships at that. Secondly, if you really go into what happens on the 24th of October, first of all, the one task group, 38.1, had been detached, and one of the big fleet carriers had been detached with it because the air group was exhausted. And in fact, that's a big factor at Leyte Gulf because almost the entire carrier fleet had been in operations consistently since early September, and they were very highly fatigued. Secondly, during the 24th, you had not only the one group entirely missing, you got TG 38.3 is fending off this tremendous land-based air attack on them, and they participate very lightly in the whole action. That leaves you with only 2 of the groups participating, one of which 38.2 does strike against the southern force before it turns to the main force or whatever here. So Task Force 38 is not one concerted 17 carrier force attacking Kurita. It's very much divided, very much reduced in strength, and also very fatigued.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, got it. Yeah, no, very good. Thank you. Appreciate that. And I would just your initial comment on the old and new battleships. Absolutely correct. What's interesting, particularly when you read through the Gray Book, is this severe distinction between the OBBs, as they call them, and the new battleships. Early in the war, King is pushing Nimitz to commit the U.S. battleship force, and Nimitz keeps saying, those are old battleships. We're going to refurbish them, but they lack the speed of the Japanese fleet, even the Japanese old battleships. I'm not going to commit them until I get the new battleships. So, it's an important point. You're right. Not all battleships are the same. And there's a strict distinction between the OBBs and the new BBs in terms of effectiveness and survivability. And that's often lost. So thank you.
Yeah, if I could add to what Richard brought up about Sibian C, when I was looking at the strike analysis, it turns out another factor, and we can't discount the human factor in any of this, was an over-concentration on the Musashi by pilots. Basically, they'd never seen these ships with their eyes before. They'd heard about them, but they'd never seen them. They were obviously impressed with the size of these ships. And as it turned out, the reason Musashi, with only one strike, did not concentrate on her over the course of the day from the various American task groups, the reason Musashi kept drawing all the attacks on her was not, one, she was this gigantic thing they'd never seen before. And secondly, she was towards the fringe of the task force because she, unlike Yamato, was not the flagship. So between the combination of this is one hell of a target to attack and the fact that she's more reachable than the other one that looks like her, tended to mean that she drew all the attacks. And so she consistently, with one strike did not, but she consistently across the day was the one drawing the bombs and torpedoes.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And in fact, there was a lot of post-mission critiques after that in which the Navy flagellates itself saying, what did we do? I mean, we literally made it, we did not control the attacks. And even when it's clear it's falling behind, carrier aviators are still going in to attack it because it's the biggest, shiniest object out there. And they said after that, that nothing like that ever happened again, I believe, because they really put a strong control on what you could attack. On the other hand, 100 aircraft went after the battleship Issei and essentially got 2 minor hits on it. So even if the US carrier aviators had gone after other ships in the battle group, I'm not convinced they would have done much more damage, if any.
But check this out. I heard recently, but I still need to roll up the sleeves. When they planned the Rabaul strike in November 43, the instructions were spread the damage around. Don't over-concentrate.
They did it too.
Yeah. Mid-war, they had the knowledge to tell the pilots, you're here to create mobility damage, denials. Don't go for the sinkings. And here we are, fast forward to the Philippine campaign. That goes out the window, and you wind up getting this over-concentration on one ship at the expense of the others.
You know, and there's one other thing to bring up about Leyte Gulf also. As I recall, off Samar, you had these pathetic 6 escort carriers being pursued by a Japanese task force, including 4 battleships. And what did those 4 battleships accomplish against those CVEs? Well, not that much, although it was a great hit by Yamato at long range. But what the carriers did was they kept making attacks, and the Japanese ships, battleships, in particular the cruisers, had to keep maneuvering. And when they maneuvered, their gunfire accuracy fell off very dramatically, became very ineffective, plus smoke or whatever here. So if you couldn't do better than that against the CVEs, maybe you need a footnote about that.
Yeah, I'll even say one of the CVEs sank a Japanese cruiser because a 5-inch shell hit a long lance torpedo on deck and blew it up. So I could credit that to naval aviation, I guess. But then again, the center of gravity for the Japanese fleet was hitting the amphibious force, with most of which had been withdrawn. So the whole point is the battleships are not going after the carriers. The battleships are going after the amphibs to try and destroy it.
Yeah, but some of the Japanese leaders clearly had figured out that, hey, by the time we get there, the amphibs are going to be gone. I mean, that may have been a hidden factor in Kurita's decision was, it's pointless. It's pointless. I'm going to lose all these guys, and ultimately, it's utterly pointless.
Yeah.
Let's not
forget. That circles back. I'm sorry. That circles back to Midway in a way. The object of the exercise was basically to destroy the U.S. fleet. That didn't work. They tried to send the surface ships out at night. They couldn't get close enough because Spruance danced away from them, and so. Yeah. I mean, the amphibious force was withdrawn because the mission had lost its purpose. You know, it was meaningless to seize Midway without the actual destruction of the U.S. fleet.
Well, you know, I'll quibble on that too. Yes, the traditional. Well, yeah, it was, but I would also point out that Yamamoto had a twofold objective for the seizure of Midway, and one was to establish a foothold in the Hawaiian Islands that could eventually be turned into a base of operations, move down the chain, and capture Oahu as a bargaining chip. So there was a political dimension to that assault as well, beyond just sinking the American carrier force. It doesn't get as much press as sinking the carriers, but it was certainly there.
I read an author who said that one of the reasons that they went for Midway was because of Doolittle's raid, because the Japanese had sworn that nobody was going to touch Tokyo, and within a few months we hit. You guys haven't read that anywhere else. That was one guy then. Okay.
That's a myth. Actually, the bureaucratic fight to authorize the Midway operation had been won by Yamamoto in early April, and Doolittle doesn't do his thing until the 18th. Okay. I actually wanted to talk a little bit about the Mediterranean because I actually do think that your thesis, you can tell I have some quibbles about the Pacific, and I'm not entirely sold, but I do feel like in the Mediterranean, your thesis resonates with me, that you look at what happens to the balance of naval power in the Med when the Valiant and Queen Elizabeth get put on the bottom of Alexandria, and all of a sudden there's this window of opportunity for the Italians. Shipping losses go down, you know, Rommel's getting more gas, and things are, you know, the fat's really in the fire for the British. So I do think that there are some useful lessons to be garnered there.
I think on the British side, part of the problem is that they haven't got enough aircraft carriers. I mean, that's why the battleships are so important.
Yeah, well, but Flieger Corps 10 had taken care of that problem. You know, every time they sent a carrier into the Med, they got their butts handed to them.
Actually, I think in the Mediterranean also, and I think this is often neglected, I think the U.S. Army Air Force is really important in 1943 and 44, and it has a kind of neglected role in destroying Italian warships once there are airfields in North Africa. Can I make one other point, and that's that the European Pacific balance, there are only ever 2 American fast battleships in the Atlantic. And the ones that are there the rest of the time are actually training ships or the most obsolete warships in the American fleet. And King doesn't want to send anything into Europe. Final point is about the Montanas. If there is, if the anti-battleship bias is a post-war revisionist thing, why is the Montana program canceled in 1942?
Very good point.
Oh, well, I go to 2 things. One is, according to Friedman, it was originally suspended because of the lack of steel. Then they were going to put it back online. King never liked it. He thought it was too big with too little firepower and never became a proponent. But the other one, I go back to Davidson, his Unsinkable Fleet, who said there were projections in 1941, 42, 43 of how many battleships the U.S. was going to lose. And in the event, the U.S. lost 0. And so if you don't lose any battleships, and you have I have other fast battleships on the way. I think I had Illinois and Kentucky. I had a couple of battle cruisers on the way, which were not even going to be commissioned until 1946. I think King said, listen, I don't like Montana. It's not a design I want, and I'm not going to see it at best until 1947 or 48. I'd have to go back and look. What's the point in pursuing this? So, but if I honestly believe if the war had gone on, and particularly if it looked like the Russians were going to invest heavily in a battleship force, a modern battleship force, I'm guessing the Montana class would have been reevaluated and might have been put back on the docket somewhere late in the war. I don't know.
What do you make of the battleship activity off Norway in the German invasion of Norway? It's impressive. That's a case where air power wasn't able to play too much role. I mean, have you looked at that closely, 1940?
Yeah, I mean, not recently. That was in my original, and I covered that fairly extensively in my original work, but I haven't looked at it in several years. It's interesting that battleships were used heavily in the Norwegian Sea in order to escort convoys, but always outside of land-based air of Japanese aircraft coming out of Norway. And they would always break loose because they were terrified of land-based air. You know, this is another argument why the Central Pacific drive. So you could get it so far from Japanese land-based air, you wouldn't have to worry about it. But I was kind of amazed when you look at these convoys, which are skirting up the east coast of Greenland and then breaking off real early because of fear of Ju-87s and, you know, HE-111s coming out and attacking the battleships. People were terrified of land-based air versus battleship attack in the Atlantic. In retrospect, the Luftwaffe was a lot better than the Japanese Air Force. The Ju-87 could carry a 2,000-pound bomb in a dive, which probably against an old battleship would have proven extremely problematic. So there was, but it was never really tested. We never really knew how well, you know, the Luftwaffe would do against modern battleships, and you know, with the periphery of Europe.
You know, one of the dimensions.
Bombs really reduced their range. The U.S. 1,600-pound AP was not popular because it really limited the Dauntless. The 1,000-pounder gave it much more range.
Mm-hmm.
Well, one more thing I'd point out: Norman Friedman's Fighters Over the Fleet is very impressive as usual, being Norman's work. But one thing that really struck me was he talks about how we had this dominance at Philippine Sea in terms of carriers being able to at least apparently fend for themselves. And then off Okinawa, then the Japanese changed their tactics and whatever. But basically the carriers now appear to be a lot more vulnerable. And Norman talks about how that carries on into the post-war period. This becomes an obsession with the U.S. fleet, that the carriers in fact are a whole lot more vulnerable than they seemed in 1944 in the heyday of you know, the fast carriers or whatever here. So maybe that aspect about what you're writing about you can attach that or add that to your argument, is that really maybe the big problem is not so much carriers versus battleships, it's the vulnerability of the carriers by 1945 and into the post-war period, and God knows even worse now.
Well, you're absolutely right about that. I mean, I think battleships were sufficiently armored enough to be adequately survivable up through the end of the war and probably into the 1950s. A couple of things that really changed. The introduction of the SSN-2 Styx missile in the 1950s, which could penetrate 4 feet of armor. 4 feet. Now, it was somewhat defeatable because of the range and because of the radar. Now you get into the 1970s. The next big step is the AS-4 Kitchen, launched by the backfire, 200-mile standoff range with a high dive. Now it's becoming really problematic. And now today, I mean, you have a 1,000, soon 2,000-mile standoff with a missile that comes in at Mach 12. There is no active defense that can defeat modern anti-ship ballistic and cruise missiles. I'm convinced of that. Salvo numbers, sheer numbers of weapons coming in. You can't armor enough. You know, you're going to have to go to some type of incredibly rigorous passive defense, which means ships don't look like ships anymore. You know, we're in a new era here, whereas I think defense predominated through World War II. The offense predominates, you know, since World War II and today. It's totally different, totally different.
So basically the seas will become a no man's land.
Yes, in contested areas, that's the great fear, is that if you have two highly matched opponents, which have long-range precision standoff strike and ubiquitous sea surveillance, which, you know, arguably we're getting to in the near future with these huge constellations of communications and ISR satellites, where satellites are too cheap to kill, too numerous to kill, linked up with missiles that penetrate active defenses. You are looking at a prospective huge areas of no man's seas or no man's lands in contested areas. And I think people don't want to believe that's happening, but it is happening.
Yeah.
Jim, to pick up on your thesis of carriers not being sea control platforms, but that they're area denial platforms, if you look at today's situation with the South China Sea and the growing dominance there of or role of China versus the U.S. and its allies, what role do you see the carrier playing in this coming situation?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, you know, the U.S. showed that it wants to persist in conducting a strike off of with using tactical aircraft with limited range, you know, without aerial refueling. Joint Strike Fighter, you know, the range of a Joint Strike Fighter is commonly given as about 600 miles. So the Chinese developed the DF-21. It's both a land attack and an anti-ship missile that goes to 1,000 miles. They now have the DF-26, a 2,000-mile land attack missile, and we expect an anti-ship ballistic missile variant to that within the next year or so. So it's a question of, you know, you can't get outside of that range without this incredibly long air tanker bridge to bring you back in. And of course, the Navy doesn't own any land-based tankers. And where do you base these tankers if, you know, your land bases are at risk out to 1,000, 2,000 or more nautical miles? So what does the carrier do? Can you sufficiently protect the carrier with passive defenses to get it close? Well, it was not designed to be low signature. It's not like the DDG-1000, I mean, which was designed to have an extremely low signature. So this is the debate that's going on. I mean, this massive debate. Is the carrier adequately survivable in this era of long-range precision strike in terms of the numbers of weapons that are being brought to bear and the ranges of those weapons, coupled with this ubiquitous sea sensing capability, which we're seeing develop over the current years? And so that gets us back to the critical questions. What, you know, should I continue to build carriers? What role do they play? This is a debate which is raging right now, because if I don't, then what does my fleet become? What is the organizing principle for the fleet, and what's my icon for the fleet? It's always been the carrier in my lifetime, in your lifetimes, most of you, I think. So now what? This is the question of the age.
Well, hi, John. I wanted to let everybody talk over the Pacific War before I weighed in on the critical questions. And looking at it from an international relations specialist point of view instead of a historian point of view, I can answer those critical questions based on my, quote, theory of navies. The organizing principle of the US Navy and the fleet's icon is the aircraft carrier, because the aircraft carrier is the most useful ship to have in peacetime or small wars.
Yeah.
World wars come around well, we haven't had one in 70 years. And if the Navy's role is actually controlling the geoeconomic global commons, and in that way, as Mahan would say, be able to threaten other nations' trades and protect our own trade, then the most useful ship really is the aircraft carrier, because it's the most modular. So that's the reason it's still the organizing principle, and the fleet's icon is because the Navy's not designed to fight a major war against an opponent in the same way that armies are. So that's kind of the answer to that. When you pose the question of what's going to happen if you get an engagement with China, my argument is it's not going to be a naval battle in the sense that the PLAN doesn't even have to sortie. It's going to be a missile battle. And if we go down our path that we're choosing, it's going to be a missile battle between mainland China and Guam and Hawaii. To answer your questions, the carrier has a major role to play, just not in major combat today, because quite frankly, it's not going to be decided at sea. So from that perspective, that's the reasons. Now, as far as sea denial today, I think I would support you and say that sea control is not obtainable, certainly not anywhere within the first island chain. So these principles do have to change, but the reason that China, other nations are building aircraft carriers is because they think it's the most useful tool in peacetime and in small conflicts. And so that's where we're stuck on. And the whole debate is about whether we are building a Navy for the purposes of fighting China, or if we are building a Navy for other purposes. You can optimize the Navy to fight China in the way we anticipate, then that's a whole different Navy than what you would have if you're not fighting China. So I think that's part of what the debate is, and that we don't get into that as much because our focus now is fighting China. And obviously this SecDef thinks that is the only real mission for the US military, and therefore he expects the Navy to change its structure to do that. So I think that's part of the debate too. It's not simply the question of whether the carriers are effective in a major combat against two high technology opponents. Well, probably not, unless you radically redesign them. Is the carrier a useful tool in peacetime because it is air base that you can pull into anywhere you want to beat up on other people? Well, yeah, it's a very useful tool. So I think that's part of the debate too. Now I'll shut up. End of my monologue.
No, thanks, Sam. Good to see you. And I think you captured it. Thank you.
Simmons, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, hi. Doug Shorberg in San Diego. I just want to let you know there has to always be an aircraft carrier. Otherwise, we destroyer men haven't got anything to chase around the ocean on Plague Guard.
Let me ask, what about building a ship that was kind of a hybrid, meaning not a hybrid design, but a combination of the former Soviet battle cruiser types like the Kirov and the Peter the Great, and the Yamato, meaning heavily protected against missile strikes, where it's kind of, you know, if not impervious, very resistant to the modern missiles and weapons and cruise missiles. When you saw Operation Crossroads, the atomic test on the capital ships there, those lessons, it seems to me, you come full circle. Maybe you could reapply some of those. If you made a Kirov type battle cruiser that was equipped to stay offshore and take blows while covering a landing or an operation, or even an operation with carrier strikes, like if you're aware of that, a torpedo strike on a Korean dam in 1951, and they knocked the dam down. You could still see inland uses for carrier strikes if they're able to survive and approach the coast and be protected. And so it's an idea. I was wondering, why not build a vessel like that, kind of a new design that combines a bit of both?
Yeah, I think it's hard to have confidence that you could ever build a ship today which has adequate survivability once it's targeted and hit by any weapon. Weapon penetrating power and explosive power is just, you know, out of sight. I mean, even one weapon without a warhead, we've taken hits on cruisers which have knocked the entire combat system offline because they're so vulnerable. And I think the view is you have to go to a DDG-1000 type hull, which is inherently stealthy against EO, RF, and acoustics. Although, it's when you look at it, it's 12,000 tons. It's gigantic. Looks like a giant moving building. But I mean, there was, the Navy decided in 1992 that we're going to make this major commitment to build the next generation of guided missile destroyers, which were inherently stealthy. And that was the DDG-1000. We eventually built 3, cost us $22 billion for 3 hulls with no combat systems. And it was Admiral Roughhead as CNO who said, I got to pull the plug on this. There's no end in sight. We went back to the DDG-51 Flight 3, which is a non-stealthy ship. And now the Navy is debating back and forth. If the carrier, as Sam said, if the carrier is not going to be my high-end fighting platform for China, Russia, others, and something else has to go in. I need a surface ship to go in close, maybe to take surface-to-air missiles to kill aircraft. Maybe that's why I have to be close. What does this surface ship look like? And then people keep drifting back to the old 1990s version of the Arsenal ship. It's an inherently stealthy platform that blends into sea clutter that has no defensive armament, but only offensive armament. And we keep going round and round year after year back to the Arsenal ship, but the Navy just does not want to do that. They want ships that look like ships. I mean, it is a real dilemma. Now that we are in an era of the dominance of long-range precision strike, which is only going to get worse. And I'll say this, at the Beijing parade last October, the Chinese rolled out the DF-17. That's a hypersonic glide vehicle. I mean, they're moving beyond ballistic missiles to HGVs. That HGV cruises at like 30, 40 kilometers. It's above something like an SM-6 or Patriot, but well below an SM-3. You get a free ride at Mach 20 till you get to the target. And then you're diving in and slowing down. But I mean, we're at the leading edge of a major revolution in warfare in which if you're seen, you're hit, you can't be seen. How do you not be seen? That's the bottom line.
Well, I think submariners would tell you that the need for surface platforms may be, you might not need them at all.
Sure. I mean, submariner, and they have a point, because I think when you get into underwater clutter in the open ocean, all the advantages go to the hider from the finder. Now, I do have to get out into open water to do that, but then again, that somehow I have to connect that to a sensor. RF energy doesn't penetrate the ocean. Somehow something's got to go up and find the target and tell the submarine, okay. So there's challenges there. Plus the submarine is not a control platform. It's a denial platform. I mean, it can kill things, but it cannot control sea area. So you're right. I mean, the submarine is a natural step forward. And look what we're doing with the Virginia-class SSN. Virginia payload tubes on all new Virginias. Looks like we're going to put Virginia payload module on all future Virginias, which means I'm going to have a little mini SSGN. I'm going to have the tubes. I just got to fill them with ordnance. But now I got a bang up sea denial platform as long as I can connect it to a sensor somewhere without making the submarine vulnerable. But it's a sea denial platform. It's not a sea control platform.
Right, and that really goes back to my points, being a long-term proponent of Arsenal ship. My argument on Arsenal ship now is no longer, because the Navy won't accept it as a major warship, is now your resupply. That since we don't have the capabilities of reloading missiles at sea, you bring your reloads behind you as an arsenal ship, because you're never going to get the AEs there to reload your magazines. But going back to the war, but going back to the war on China, I mean, if we want to focus the Navy on it, then we need to be pumping out SSNs, because that's what we need in that. Because our goal is not to capture China, our goal is to prevent them from breaking out. So really, we don't have a sea control goal, I would argue, and within the waters around China, we have a sea denial goal. So yeah, surface ships are great, and surface ships are great tools in most of the time. But if we're completely focused on a high-end war with China having hypersonic weapons, we having hypersonic weapons, then the SSN is obviously what we should be building, and in numbers.
Well, I don't know if we could sustain the nuclear talent for that. So we may have to seriously examine the modern SSs if it's a numbers game.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, production alone is an issue. I mean, you know, everybody says we want to ramp up production of SSNs, but I don't know where we find the people to build these. Where do we find people to man them? I think manning is probably a little easier, but you know, I go down an electric boat every once in a while, and that workforce down there is about 55 years old on average. It's not clear where we get the people to build these submarines, and it is incredibly technically challenging, you know, to go inside and do this.
Especially when you see what it takes to have a nuclear qualified crew.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I'm working on a study right now on the future of aircraft carriers, and one of the pieces, you examine them in a variety of ways, but one of the ways that I'm examining the worth and stuff is as an industrial policy. Newport News is the largest private, has the most number of employees in the Commonwealth of Virginia as a private company. You know, FDR has proven that building ships is a way of creating top-end blue-collar jobs, which what we want to do. So the question of where you're going to find people is going to be determined by future administrations based on what industrial policy they want to pursue. COVID has shown us the limits to a service-based economy. And I would argue that one of the justifications for carriers in the future will be as preserving high-end blue-collar jobs, quite frankly, which is not our focus, but that's going to be one of the arguments. And that applies, of course, to the SSNs too. I know we're getting way off the subject, so I'm going to back off on these ideas.
And I think I turned. I have a question. With the rise of social media activists and internet influencers and things like that, is that going to shape national defense policy as well? I mean, you got cancel culture acting on all kinds of things they don't like.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not an authority to answer that question. I honestly don't know what's going on. You know, my view is the military seems to be largely, I deal with military officers on a daily basis. I always have at least 15 students. They seem to be largely insulated from all of that. They just seem to be. They live in the military world just like they did when I was at JO. I don't see that as changing.
Wrap this up now. Can people hear me at all?
Just barely.
Barely.
Hey, Jim. I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. We've run about a half an hour over, and I think this has really been a great session. is there any last comment or question anybody wants to make on this?
Can I say something?
Yes.
James?
Yes.
Do you know or have heard of Robert Lundgren?
Yes, I have. He's a prolific author.
He has done a lot of work and study on a very similar idea about how the battleship wasn't obsolete, and refers to them more as siege engines that were the key to holding coastlines during invasions and everything else, and resisting counterattacks and all that. I just mentioned him because you might want to talk to him. You might want to correspond. I can pass your name on it.
He was going to join the discussion today. Robert was, but apparently.
Oh, he was? He knows about this? Good.
Oh, yeah, he knows about this, and he was going to participate, but I see he never joined us. But there will be a recording available, and I'll make sure that he has access to the recording so that he can listen in on this. But yeah, Robert would be a good person a good brain to pick.
Yeah, especially about this topic.
Yes, on this issue, exactly. And there's other things that I'm curious about. I think I'm going to probably come to you outside this forum, Jim, and just a couple points that I think are important in your whole thesis here. But on the whole, I think this has been very, very interesting. And there will be a recording available. We'll send out a message when it is posted and up. And having said that, I thank you very much, Jim, for your time and your participation. I'm pleased so many people were able to join us today and listen in. It's been very, very interesting. And I think it's a topic that does need to be discussed at some length. I think there are more sides to the question than what is commonly thought as far as how the war at sea went, and particularly how the war in the Pacific went. I think there's more going on here than simplifications can really express. So having said that, I want to thank you and go ahead and call this a meeting. I think next month we're going to have another session, and there'll be news about that coming out. And that's pretty much it from my end. So thank you.